name's Tim Segal, Academic Director of ERM, and I'd like to welcome and introduce the panel so you know who's addressing you. We have to my immediate right, we have Tom Brandt, who's member of the Federal Senior Executive Service. If you don't know what that is, you should look it up, very impressive. And Chief Risk Officer of the IRS, Internal Revenue Service. He's also, in his spare time, he manages to have some spare time, president of AFIRM, the Association for Federal Enterprise Risk Management, whose mission is to advance ERM practices in federal government. Prior IRS positions Tom has held in areas of planning analysis, research, performance management, and evaluation. Among prior roles before that, head of tax administration unit at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. To his right is Russ Charlton, who's global head of enterprise risk management, technology compliance, business continuity, and disaster recovery planning and internal audit. You have no free time at WeWork. Among his prior roles are Senior Vice President and Chief Auditor for Time Inc., where he also had responsibility for enterprise risk management and co-oversight of global information security. And prior to that, VP and Deputy Chief Auditor at Time Warner, focusing on the content-generating divisions of HBO, Warner Brothers, and Time Inc. He has a BS in accounting from University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and a certificate of professional achievement in enterprise risk management from right here at Columbia. Russ was one of our first students. A little unusual. We have some, like 10% or so, have more experience. Most of our students are younger. Russ had 30 years of experience in that role, and very graciously came on our info sessions. If you wanted a recording, I can share that with you. We have documented evidence of this. Russ would say, this is exactly what I hoped it would be. I'm learning real skills that I'm taking back to Time Inc. to learn how to do my new job of Chief Risk Officer there. So I think that says quite a bit. At that point, I would drop the mic, and just, we would close the info session, we were done. So thank you very much for your support of the program. He's also a certified public accountant and certified internal auditor. To his right is Oliver Jakob, International Chief Risk Officer at Mitsubishi UFJ Securities. Among his prior roles, Global Head of Market Risk at UBS Investment Bank. Also various risk management positions in New York and Toronto. He's got a diploma from Karlsruhe University in Germany in industrial engineering and is a CFA. To his right, on my extreme right, is Eric Yoss. Eric Yoss is Chief Risk Officer at Mizuho Financial Group's operations in the Americas, with responsibility for the risk governance framework, risk appetite, and measuring and controlling all risks, where the scope includes economic risks, credit, market, liquidity, capital, and other core risks, operational and model risk. Eric is also Chief Risk Officer for Mizuho Americas and all regulated subsidiaries. Among other prior roles, several senior roles at Barclays, including Head of Risk for the Americas and Chief Risk Officer for Barclays Capital, member of the Management Committee for Global Market Risk at Deutsche Bank, and several positions in structured finance, credit, portfolio, and risk management at J.P. Morgan. He has a BS in systems engineering from University of Virginia. So I think if we didn't have your attention before, hopefully we have it now. These are folks you want to hear from, and they've graciously agreed to share their views on a number of questions that I think you'll be interested to hear. So we're going to start. I'm going to kick it off and just throw the question to one of the panelists, and then the others can pick up as you like. So I'd like to start with you, Tom, and I'd like to start with asking you, what is particularly rewarding about your job?
Well, Sim, thanks, first of all, for the invitation to be on the panel today, and really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my perspective and experiences with ERM. I think everyone here probably knows the IRS, and if you don't, we are the U.S. tax agency that basically funds the federal government. This year alone, we collected $3.5 trillion, and we have about 76,000 employees. But in terms of what I think is rewarding around my job as CRO is, many of you may also know that the IRS went through some really difficult times probably about 6 years ago, and in fact experienced a major crisis, which resulted in change in leadership and unfortunately significant cuts in our budget, and an erosion in staffing. And it was a very difficult time, I think, for the organization overall, and certainly for all of the employees. And I think that the establishment of our ERM program and the establishment of the CRO position has really helped the agency recover from those challenging times and actually put in place some mechanisms that hopefully are helping the agency avoid getting into a similar situation. So I think if we're able to run as effectively as we're striving, we should be able to prevent that next crisis or have equipped ourselves with capability to respond, I think, quite rapidly to any event. The other, I think, big area that we've focused on, and I think that has helped, is creating more open lines of communication. You can imagine a government agency spread out throughout the United States and with offices overseas as well, trying to maintain and encourage communications across all of the respective units can be a challenge, and particularly as you're looking at risk and problems. I think as most organizations, and certainly in government, people take ownership in trying to solve their own problems, but don't necessarily think through how what they're doing to fix their problem could create a problem for another part of the organization. And so I think we've tried to help facilitate that cross-organizational collaboration and sharing of risk and also risk responses to try and help the agency overall.
Thank you, Tom. Any other panelists want to comment on what you find particularly rewarding about your job?
I think one of the more interesting aspects of risk management is the idea that it intersects with the entire organization. I think a lot of people, enter an organization in a given department and in a given skill set, and they tend to, be involved in that function and hopefully become experts. But I think, risk is one thing that transcends all elements of all businesses. And so the ability to sit in a risk role and see all parts of the organization and to understand how everything works and understand how everything intersects, as Tom mentioned, how there's knock-on effects of risk taking in one place affecting other areas. So it's very rewarding to be able to get a broad picture of the business, and it's a great way to to really understand sort of the soup to nuts operation of whatever business that you work in risk management.
Yeah, I realize there's probably not time for us each to answer every question, but I'll just throw in just a short bit on this one. I think one of the most rewarding parts of the job is when you help executive management realize something they haven't realized before. So they typically think they have a pretty good handle on all the various risks and have good insight. And this goes back to my prior job, but we did a survey where we asked a certain set of questions to the board and to then executive management, which was defined as EVP and the EVPs and the CEO, and then a level down, which was there was some SVPs, but a lot of VPs. And the board and the executive management answered the questions almost exactly the same. But the VP level had a lot of disconnects from what these people thought. And when we presented that to our CEO and the EVPs, you could just see their eyes, kind of get big as they realized that what they perceived as risk and what they thought was happening with communication was very different than the way that the vice presidents saw it. And that really, we probably spent an ad hoc hour of discussion around that alone that was unplanned. And it was really rewarding to actually be there and facilitate that discussion with those guys. So you really get the chance to bring information at the highest levels of the organization that they may not have put it together the same way before.
So let me stick with you, Russ, and let me ask the opposite. What are the most challenging aspects of your job?
But you have to talk to executive management all the time. No, it's I think part of it is actually the other side of the sword of what Eric was saying, is that you're getting involved in the entire company. And it's true that we need to know a little bit about the entire company, and very few other people in the organization do that. And so I often feel a little overwhelmed and a little bit like I'm not fully doing my job, because it's almost impossible to know everything that's going on everywhere in a company. And in my particular case, and I'd like to keep my remarks more to just the general of the job versus specifically at WeWork. But at WeWork, if you don't know the company, we're growing at 100% a year and have every year for the last 8 years. We've opened, I was the 5,200 and something employee. We have over 12,000 employees now, and I started last April.
Wow.
So, a year ago April, I've been there for 14 months. So, we went from 250,000 members to over 500,000 members in that same time period, and we're doubling again this year. So, keeping up with what the company is doing. We just bought a construction company in Latin America. No risk there. Just all the things that are going on is what's challenging, because you feel responsibility to know a little bit about all of that that's going on.
I think after the crisis, I think regulation is a big challenge for us in the regulated sector, I guess. I think there's lots of it. You look at Basel III, Volcker, LCR, NSFR, all kinds of cyber model risk, 11-7, third-party risk. You can go through. And I think a lot of it is, I think those are good topics to force people to think about, but I think the implementation is quite complicated because many rules are very prescriptive and multi-layered. So I think that's definitely a thing. And then the other thing for us as a very global organization, I think we're operating in 60 countries or so. There's a lot of regulation, but it's totally uncoordinated. So what's on the books in Japan versus in London versus in the US could be all over the place. And then if you're operating on all these things, you're essentially kind of doing the same thing 3 or 4 times for different audiences. And I think that that is a challenge. It's a compliance challenge, but it's also an engineering challenge on how do you calibrate all these processes to comply with that without exploding your cost base.
I might just add one other comment too. I think an area that's challenging for me particularly is as we get further away from kind of the crisis event that we had, and as we get new executives who probably weren't in the organization at that time, and for them, they think everything's going well. They don't necessarily see the need for ERM because they view, well, everything's fine, and the problem is somewhere else in the organization. So you probably spend your time over there. I've got my stuff covered. And I think that oftentimes is the environment where you have the greatest potential for risk, is because people stop sort of maybe following some of the controls and doing some of the checks because, well, nothing's happened so far, everything's fine, so maybe we can lessen up on that. And I think, again, trying to just reinforce the value and the importance of ERM, again, across the organization and to new executives can be sometimes a bit challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd add to that. I mean, it just sort of, build on that. I think the biggest challenge is sometimes helping people remember or helping people to associate with remote events. Particularly in finance, the big things that go wrong are remote enough for people to easily dismiss them. But when they go wrong, they are catastrophic. So, Boeing's a perfect example, right? So it is a remote event, and it can just have catastrophic effects. And so to try to understand the psychology of that, understand that management really can't relate, like people can't relate with risks that are that remote, and so you have to enforce the discipline of not ignoring these things and addressing these things, but at the same time, your job in risk management isn't to eliminate the risk, or to even manage the risk, but rather to make sure that the risk is transparent, and that you're aware of the risks that you're taking in what you do.
So let me stick with you, Eric, and let me ask another question. What is the role of ERM and risk in your organization? You started taking us down that path, but can you expand on that? Sure.
So I guess it is just an expansion of some of what I've just said, which is that particularly for a financial institution, the role of risk management is not to eliminate risk. Or not even to minimize risk, but rather to make sure that you are able to take risk, right? So the role of risk management, particularly for a financial institution, is to facilitate the ability of the institution to take the risks that it wants to take. And I guess that's the real key thing, is that, every business takes risks in everything they do. banks lend money, that's a risk. Like, airlines fly airplanes, like people build buildings. Like these all entail risks. And so the idea is you need to facilitate the ability of the organization to take that risk. And part of facilitating that ability is to help the institution, understand the risks that it's taking. So to systematically be able to help the firm identify all the risks that it's taking, whether they're operational, transactional, financial, legal, compliance, what have you. And then to help the institution understand and develop what their appetite is. So to understand, okay, we are in the business of taking this risk. How much of this do we want to take? Can we take? And then also to then hold the institution accountable for that decision. So the institution has made a decision of the risks it wants to take. The institution has made a decision about the amount of risk that it wants to take. And then risk management's role is to then enforce that, to develop the framework that says, okay, then these are the rules that we're going to play by, and this is how we're going to quantify that risk, and to ensure that risk-taking is transparent to all the stakeholders. One of the mantras I think that's across all risk managers is that things are going to go wrong. You're going to lose money. That's all inherent in taking risk. What you don't want are surprises. You don't want to have something go wrong. You don't want to find out that you were taking a risk that nobody knew about, or that you didn't want to take, or you weren't willingly taking. And so it's also, after you've quantified it, set the appetite, to make sure that you are being transparent to all the stakeholders about the risks that you're taking.
I think the devil is really very much in the detail, right? I mean, on paper it seems pretty easy. You set a risk appetite, and then you just got to develop a bunch of tools and models and monitoring processes to make sure you stay within a risk appetite. That's pretty fair enough. But if you go through it, the more mature risks arguably are the financial risk, market and credit risk that people have been doing for a long time. But you see that even in the crisis, things lost 50 to 100 times as much as some of these tools and models predicted they would for AAA mortgage-backed securities. And then you have things like, cybersecurity and things like that. What is even your risk appetite for cybersecurity? Do you have any risk appetite for cybersecurity? But I think you can't open a computer if you have zero risk appetite for cybersecurity. You should throw it out the window. So I think when you get to how you actually implement that, there's a lot of interesting trade-offs and a lot of interesting discussions. Now, the fascinating part about risk is I think there are a lot of interesting discussions to be had, which is good. The frustrating part is you're kind of never done. It never ends.
Yeah. I would just add that it's a little different, I think, in a non-financial organization. There's no models, there's no tools that help us manage risk. We have some around, in treasury, but we don't do a lot of hedging. We don't have a lot of FX. We're not really in those sort of markets. Our risks are more around, are we selecting, the right buildings to lease in, and is there a good market there? Are we going into the right countries? Should we start business in South Africa this year? Should we go, we're now looking at Russia, that sort of thing. So it's, and is this the right price? Should we build our own windows and doors, or should we source it from a third party? And both of those have risk, right? We could screw it up, or we could have supplier risk. So we're looking at risks that are more around construction and leasing. And my group gets involved in operational risk, and risk around whether or not are we willing to give our big members longer payment terms? I mean, most people pay their rent on day one, the first day of the month it's due. But we're a service. We're space as a service. We're not leasing to you. We're providing a service to you that is space. So people want to pay us in 60, 90, 120 days like they pay their other bill. So that's a new risk to us as we grow into a different market of customer. So my role is kind of on a daily basis trying to figure out what the hell WeWork is doing and are we accepting an appropriate amount of risk. And we haven't defined any risk appetites because no one even realizes the risk they're taking until after they've taken them. So it's very interesting.
So let me pose this one to Oliver first. If you can comment on the importance of a balance of technical ERM risk skills and communication, leadership, managerial skills in your job and in the jobs of your staff.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think a lot of people obviously start in the industry with a lot of technical skills. But the interesting thing is that almost everything involves many, many, many stakeholders. You know, when you're a credit officer, you're going to have the relationship managers and the investment bankers who talk to clients on the other side. If you're a market risk officer, you're going to have traders or salespeople on the other side. There's really nothing happens kind of in a vacuum. And so I think, absolutely, I think as people get more senior, really the communication, how you present it, kind of making pervasive arguments, that just becomes, I think, a much more meaningful part of it. I think the technical skills are a toolbox that you can hopefully always build on and fall back on, but it's really about influencing the organization and getting to a point. And yes, we have policies and limits and all these tools, but you can't really hide behind that. I think you need to explain to people why that makes sense and why you have those risk appetite and why if you go beyond it, it's maybe too concentrated or too big a risk and it's not the right thing for the organization. So I think that really exponentially becomes more and more important the more you're in a position to kind of try to influence the organization.
I think you certainly need to understand and I think be proficient in the technical side of it. But given the nature of some of the discussions that we have around the risks, and particularly those areas that I think that own the risk or where the risk is emerging, they can become defensive or those conversations can become pretty heated. So I think it's important to have good facilitation skills and capability to try to moderate and I guess help facilitate those discussions in a productive way. And again, the important thing too is trying to facilitate that environment where everybody feels comfortable pointing out risks. So like from a leadership or management perspective, how are you working with your employees and your colleagues and the way in which you interact so that it's, when somebody shares bad news, it's, you don't give them that look of, oh no, here we go again, but kind of, well, thanks for bringing it to our attention and now let's see what we can do about it.
It's interesting. I think very often, particularly in the financial world, people associate risk management with quantitative skills. Mm-hmm. But much like as you were describing for WeWorks, things rarely lend themselves into black and white decisions, right? Even when you're dealing with financial risk and you've got models that are giving you numbers, they're not giving you a yes or a no. They're giving you a 65-45 answer, and so Ethan Berman, I think was his name, was one of the first executives for Risk Metrics, which was one of the early risk management firms that spun out of J.P. Morgan, and he made it a point when they set up their offices to hang art on the wall, as a statement to say that risk management is an art. It's not a science. There are scientific elements to it, but how you implement it in an organization, is artistic. It's about your ability to influence. It's about your ability to communicate. It's about your ability to, persuade people about, points of view or things they should consider.
And I would just add, I think it evolves over your career. I mean, I think as a young, and I didn't start in ERM, I think most people know that. I'm an accountant and an auditor first. I made my name and was successful because I was a good accountant and a good auditor. As a staff auditor, no one cared what my managerial skills were. So I had to do that first and prove myself. And then from there, I moved up through the ranks of my accounting firm and then ultimately in an internal audit department where I was asked to then take over risk management by our board. And that's some 20-something, 30, as you pointed out, years later, I started doing enterprise risk management. Today, my skill sets, the things I rely on, are much more my managerial and interpersonal skills than my technical skills. And I have a broad enough responsibility that there's no way I can have the technical skills in all the areas, so I have to rely on people that work for me, or even some that don't. Like in Treasury, I talk to the Treasury guys regularly about certain risks that we have no one in my group that has that skill set. So you sort of have to be have the ability to be an influencer, right? That's getting people to do things for you that you don't have direct responsibility over. So whether it's in Treasury or whether it's in accounts payable or billing or whatever it might be, I'm talking to people all the time about what do they think the risk is. And I think that, so it kind of turns almost 180 degrees over the course of a 30-year career.
So this one, Tom, if you could start us off. Describe the entry-level ERM or risk job opportunities in your areas.
Yeah, I think, probably, for staff just beginning with ERM programs, and certainly in the government agencies, whether you're supporting kind of the corporate level ERM or the functional or business unit ERM, is I think the areas where a lot of that work is taking place is in supporting the enterprise risk assessment activities, so helping to facilitate the assessment, helping to capture, document those discussions, the identification of risk. Certainly maintaining and developing risk registers is an area that the staff would support. Helping with evaluating unit level risk, so if you're at the corporate level, certainly assessing and evaluating the unit level risk registers and using that information and helping to compile the enterprise risk. I'd say facilitating and helping support the Executive Risk Committee and the risk working groups, depending on how each organization sets those up. So, those groups typically are managing and making the decisions on the final set of top risks and risk appetite. So helping to, I think, facilitate the operations of those meetings. Developing communication materials might be another area. Helping with functional risk management activities. If you're at the corporate level, again, you may be assisting some of the functions in performing their risk management activities. And I would just make one note in the federal government. I mean, the breadth of what the agencies do is so expansive and so different that the specific areas you might focus on will vary with agency, but I think some of those basic activities would be conducted and performed in most ERM programs.
I mean, I think, in terms of entry level opportunities, they're at least in banking, they're equally across the board. But I'd suppose that it's more, market risk is probably a bit less of an emphasis as the regulators have wrung that out of the banking system. Squeezed.
Was it?
They've really sort of forced that out of the banking. But credit is fundamental to everything banks do, and so banks by definition will never get out of credit risk. But also, a lot of the interesting work is done on the operational risk these days. Banks are just starting to grapple with the idea of the magnitude of the operational risk they run, whether it's cyber or information security or or even premises and security. It's all sorts of operational risk, and banks are very used to quantifying everything, and so it drives them nuts to have a risk like cyber, where you have no idea how to explain to anybody how much risk you're taking, right? Or what's your risk appetite? As Oliver said, you have every bank has an appetite for cyber risk, because if you didn't, you would simply turn off all your computers. So the moment you turn your computers on, you've said, I've got an appetite to do this, and so then it's just a matter of do I air gap every computer I have, or I can't do that, and so you have to start to then decide. And so the ability to help banks quantify that in the operational risk space, is where a lot of interesting work is being done these days.
I'd say the staff level, and I have 2 people that are in the staff level and 1 manager, so I have 3 people in my ERM organization that are kind of below the director level. They do a number of things. They play a big role in the annual kind of risk assessment and documenting all of that. They dig into operational risk failures, and they're almost like a mini little audit staff that look at operational risk failures and try to come up with the root cause of what that is, and then document it and report back to management. Some of them are helping me draft some various policies, and right now we just put in a kind of an approval hierarchy matrix for some of the risks that we actually have the responsibility for approving, and the smaller stuff, I'm letting them deal with, because I don't want, I literally have to approve, or my department has to approve, like sometimes a $50 risk, because of just the way the billing system, the way the system works, it pops up and we're trying to fix that. But right now, I'm like, I don't need all those, so someone on my team can approve that one. So it's a lot of neat stuff. They're learning a lot. And we're building the whole function as we go. So they're in on the ground floor, as you say.
So while you're on that topic, Russ, let me stick with you and ask, what are the most common mistakes that developing ERM and risk staff make that you would like our students to avoid?
Sure. How many people here, I don't know if you're the only one that teaches it now because you've grown so much, but how many people here have taken, was it corporate value? Value-based ERM. Value-based ERM, and you have the book that Sim wrote. Turn to page 114 in his book. Key one is identifying risk at the source. And I would say that's probably the number one mistake that people make, certainly in non-financial related risk, because in my world. And I give you a couple examples. I was reading through the risks that we had that they had put together, and one of them was, well, we have a risk that insurance isn't in place before we start construction. I'm like, all right, well, that's not the risk. The insurance is the mitigating factor. The risk is all kinds of things that would happen at a construction site, but it's not that we don't have insurance. And the other one was our reconciliations aren't done. We have a risk that we don't do our reconciliations timely. Like, the reconciliation is the control, guys. That's a broken control. What's the risk of the, what's the risk there in that account? So I think newer people tend not to think about risk at its source. And so that's the one. The other one I'll tell you, which is a little bit hard, and that's a fairly easy one to correct. The harder one, I think, at least it takes more thought, is that oftentimes when individuals go into a risk assessment or risk identification meeting, and they are, and this is at all levels, I've seen it at all levels, they fall back on crutches of like, so what are your risks? Asking a direct question, or what keeps you up at night? It's the most cliche question in risk management in the world. What keeps you up at night? And I submit that that's not the right way to go about helping management understand and talk about the risk. What you really want to do is get them talking about their business. What do you do? What's the responsibility of your department? What are the things that happen here? And really learn what it is that they're doing. The risk will bubble up from that conversation. Or then you can ask some probing questions. Say, oh, I see that you're running a construction business. Do you have union employees? Oh, okay, well, what additional risk are there because we have union employees? What could go wrong there? Start
Get the rat.
Yeah, get the rat out front, right? And the chanting, And so come to Midtown someday, you'll see that. But really, I think newer people just want to get right to what's your risk? Give me the list of risks so I can check it off and get out of here. But if you really want to invest time in understanding the business, the process, or the system, and then let the risk come from that discussion. And sometimes it may take a follow-up discussion. But I think that's a mistake that a lot of risk professionals make, not just new ones.
I think to add, I think similar themes. First of all, I think with this keeping away at night, keeping up at night, I think risk managers should be entitled to a good night's sleep, just like anyone else, my personal opinion. But joking aside, I think one thing that organizations often do, the risk is kind of disconnected from the actual business. You start this kind of second line defense, but really it kind of feeds on itself and doesn't really have any hook to the first line. It's ultimately not our risk. The risk is borne by the people who actually operate controls and do things on the front line. We're hopefully identifying it and measuring it and monitoring it and finding ways to control it, but it's not our risk, so it has to be front to back, 3 lines of defense. Poor design, I think that's difficult. If you have somebody who's writing models all day long, but you also ask him to fill out 400 self-assessments every 24 hours, he's going to do a shit job doing it. There's no doubt about it. You've designed it in a way that kind of collapses under its own weight, and you're really not getting to the bottom of what you're trying to tease out. And the third part, which was interesting, there was a risk conference. There was a CRO of Prudential. He gave a talk on risk culture, and he's like, it was the keynote address, a 1-hour talk. And he starts out, there is no risk culture. And everybody's like, okay, that was fun. What we're going to do for the next 49 minutes and 45 seconds. And he said, there's only culture. And I think that's really important. I think there is no risk culture. There's only culture. I think you can't say, oh, well, we got this risk thing and they're taking care of it. But if it's not fully embedded in the organization, I think it's ultimately going to fail. It's really important that it's just CEO to last person, I think, has to be a cultural phenomenon in the organization. I think that's the only way to have a really high-performing risk organization.
Yeah, I think related to that, I think one of the bigger mistakes people make in risk management is to forget why there is risk management at the outset, right? So risk management doesn't exist for its own sake. It's not a self-fulfilling role, right? Risk management exists to help the business do what it's trying to do. And so, you know, a lot of time, again, particularly in banks, people fall back on, oh, we have to do that. The regulators demand that. You know, that's what the policy says. That's what the procedures are. But you know, you really always need to challenge yourself in risk management, take a step back and be like, well, okay, why are we doing this? Like, what is the business objective that I'm trying to achieve or that I'm trying to facilitate, you know, in doing this? I think the other big mistake that risk managers make, you know, and this is probably more at the senior level, is to think that you know the risks, because you know every major crisis was preceded by that'll never happen, you know, or just a lack of awareness of the risk, and so you know to become wedded to your risk management reports or to your policies and procedures and to always, you know, robotically rely on them to be your controls, you know, is a recipe for problems, right? You need to, you know, on a regular basis, you know, critically assess yourself, take a step back, you know, and try to think, you know, outside of your existing framework and you know, almost, you know, they call it reverse stress testing. Like, don't think about your process, but think about, like, what's the worst thing that you could think of going, you know, or you know, these are the things that I'm involved in. How, you know, what are the things that cause it to blow up, and then, you know, start to address risk in that manner.
If we could stay with you, Eric, and I wanted to ask, what are some of the general do's and don'ts just in career management generally?
Mm-hmm. I think, you know, particularly, you know, as you start out in your career, the biggest thing to take advantage of is your ability to ask questions and people's willingness to teach you. You know, you don't get that your whole career. Like once you're someplace for, you know, 5-10 years, people are going to expect you to know everything, right? So you have a limited amount of time in your first few years in an organization to ask all the questions that you want, and you'll be surprised at how much people are, you know, want to help, want to teach you, help you to understand that. So as you're trying to learn your role, you know, try to understand its context within the organization. I would think that also a key thing is to accept imperfection. You know, there is, you know, there's rarely a debate about easy decisions, right? So all the 90-10 decisions get made before they even come to anybody's desk because they're 90-10 decisions and nobody discusses them. So what people discuss are the 60-40 decisions. And you've got to make one. You've got to pick a side, and you may be right and you may be wrong, and hopefully you pick the 60 and not the 40. But you've got to sometimes, you know, close the UN, you know, make a decision and move on and recognize that, look, it's not a perfect decision. There's never going to be a perfect decision, but this is the best thing that we can do to move forward.
I might just suggest too that you need to be careful about not chasing too many opportunities too quickly. So certainly everybody's going to have a bad day, and you might say I need to go do something else. But I think in advancing your career, if you bounce around too frequently, by the time you get to that fourth or fifth opportunity and you're ready to do, and now you're saying I need to do something else, I think you can create a challenge with the organization that you might be interested in is going to say, well, how long is this person going to stick with us if they've got a history of bouncing around every 6 months to a year? So, granted, I think there's a lot of opportunity out there, and there are times, we have a bad day and we think we'd like to do something else. And it's not to say you don't want to leave a toxic workplace if you are in one, but you don't want to be bumping around so frequently that you're going to create a concern in a hiring manager that you may be somebody that's not going to be to invest in because you won't stick around long enough to recoup that.
I've also observed the other extreme of the spectrum, that people are, I think, too focused on a chimney type of career. They start out as a market risk officer and goes, 2 years, I want to be a senior market risk officer, and then I want to be a very senior market risk officer. While maybe what's actually better would be to go to become a credit risk officer or to do operational risk for a while. And you can only do that when you're really young. Once you have 50 people reporting to you, no one's going to hire you in parallel to do something that you've never done before. It's just the window has closed. So I think when you're early in your career, take opportunities to just broaden your thing. It's very few people are going to have a chimney career for 30 years to kind of stay in the same field. The other thing is really, I encourage everybody to really dig deep. I think attention to detail is never overrated. There's always a way to kind of scrape by, and there's a way to really do a fantastic job. And I think just go to that level. Early in my career, there were many meetings where, even though there were many more senior people, I was the one actually talking, because when we did a deal for a company, I actually read their 10Q the night before, and I knew what they did and what the operating trends were, while everybody else they read the 2-page primer and stuff like that. I think there is a way to go 1 or 2 levels deeper, and really people come out, whoa, this person actually really knows what he or she is talking about because they've done the work. I think it's not that hard, but I think if you put in the effort, I think it's pretty easy.
I'll just leave with one little nugget, which is, oftentimes people view risk management as someone who's trying to prevent them from doing something. You guys are going to stop us from. So if you feel you're getting that vibe, ask this question. Ask them, so do you think we're taking enough risk here? And that'll disarm them. Like, wow, this person's really having me think about the level of risk I'm taking, because that's really what we are. One of these two gentlemen made the point earlier. You got to take risk. We wouldn't be in business if we weren't taking risks. So a valid question is, are we taking enough? So that's a do. No, don't.
Oliver, what are the skills you look for in your ERM risk staff, the skills?
I think that's almost true for all risk management. I think we already touched on some of those: attention to detail, intellectual curiosity. I think you really need to. A lot of people who've been there for a long time are going to give you relatively superficial answers. I think you need to go that level down and really understand how it all works. I think work is always a good thing. And then I think risk management needs a certain maturity. I think if you're in risk, and I think that's something that I think we also look for, how people do that. You can't just sit there and be Dr. No and say, oh, the limit is this and that's all I know. And I think that's not value added, and it's kind of questionable from a career perspective. But you can't be co-opted by the business. They will tell you a very persuasive story on why this is the best trade you've ever seen in your life. But 95% of it is complete BS. So be prepared. So I think you have to have that maturity to be independent, but be part of the same team at the same time. And that's difficult to do, but maybe maybe the most important thing of all, because I think that kind of gets the information flowing and the dialogue going, and I think that's what the organization needs.
Yeah, I think this is going to echo the same thing. There's a natural tension between risk and the business. As you pointed out, the business thinks that risk management is often there just to prevent them from taking risk, and so, I think, a skill, and this is going to sound very appropriate for students, but it's do your homework. So you do have to recognize that risk management, it is a bit of a tax on the organization, right? So, it may have long-term benefits, but, when you are interacting with the business people, in their mind, they're thinking, well, I'm supposed to be out there generating revenue, but I'm talking to this guy or girl instead. And so you have to have respect for the institution's resources. And the best way to show that respect is to do your homework. Accomplish as much as you can, understand as much as you can before you start, consuming the resources, whether it's time or money or, of the firm, but particularly people's time. And so people will, give you lots of time and lots of attention if they feel like you are informed and, and being reasonable with them. You will quickly lose their attention if it's obvious that you haven't done your homework or that you are not being, reasonable or logical, in your discussions with them.
Let me pose this question to Russ. What advice, since you were a student, what advice would you give to our students to get the most out of their educational experience here at Columbia?
Sign up for as many as your classes. No. So funny, actually, it's interesting. I walked into our very first class, and I got there before you did. And I was coming directly from work, so I was dressed much like you're dressed now, much like I'm dressed now. And I was getting ready, and some students came up to me and introduced themselves and said, "Hello, Professor." As you might see, a slight resemblance between the two of us.
On the look-alike contest.
And in fact, I even had those glasses. That was before I got my new fancy red glasses.
I remember. I thought I was looking in the mirror. When I saw it.
So I was like, no, it's not me. I'm just the other guy that's been working for a few years. Anyway, so first of all, I would say I congratulate you for coming here. I mean, things like this are such a great opportunity that the school provides you. So you should take advantage not only of this, but of any of the types of opportunities that the school and the greater university provides you to enhance your educational opportunity, to meet professionals, to meet other faculty members, to just get the full experience that Columbia has to offer. So that's one piece of advice. The others, and I'll tell you, and that's kind of a piggyback on that, is to really take the time to network. And that is networking up, networking sideways, networking down, but meeting as many people as possible. And I often give this advice because I think a lot of people think, oh, I need to meet the CFO, or I need to meet the chief risk officer, the executive, because I want to network and they might be able to help me. But if you think about it, if you network and build relationships with your peers, 10 years from now, they're going to be 10 years more experienced, and they're going to be the junior chief risk officer or the deputy chief risk officer or the deputy chief auditor or whatever. And then 20 years from now, they're going to be the chief risk officer. And those are the types of people that you want to know. So if you build that relationship early on, so I have people that I've known for 30 years that are now partners in big four firms. They're chief auditors, they're chief risk officers, and I've known them since we were in university or staff auditors at Arthur Andersen. So there's absolutely nothing wrong, and it's very important to build relationships with your peers. I would tell you to really do yourself and your classmates a favor and be present in class. And I don't mean just physically, but be mentally present in class and be present and part of your group assignments. It's extraordinarily frustrating to be in a group assignment when certain members of the group are not pulling their weight. And I think not only are you doing a disservice to your group, but you're doing a disservice to yourself by not taking advantage of that, because that's what work is really like. There's a little bit of individual contribution in work, but oftentimes you're working on a team. And being in those group assignments in class is the closest to real world experience you're going to get while you're in university. So I would say that is something that I certainly, even with 30 years of experience, I very much enjoyed all of the various group projects that we did in the classes that I took here. And I built relationships and friendships, and I still meet for coffee or beer or breakfast fairly regularly with faculty members, with fellow students, because of the relationships that I built here. So take advantage of that.
We're right at 5 o'clock, so before we open it up to Q&A, I just wanted to do some comments because I've taken notes along the way. I just want to bring out a few points that you all made. Now, one point, I think this is a really interesting quote. Risk transcends all elements of all businesses. It's Eric quote. When you said that, I was thinking, Tom, 3.5 trillion, 76,000 employees. I feel for you. That's a lot to get involved with. But it's really is true. You get when you do ERM work, you get to see the strengths and weaknesses of an organization. You really get to learn a lot. It's a really unique perch to see what's going on. Another comment was, I think Russ, you made this about identifying disconnects. And I find that's really powerful insights, defining disconnects in management. Just one client example from my work. There was one client we had, and we were doing our work of the interviews and identifying what was going on, and the chief risk officer stopped the work temporarily to talk to the CEO and said, look, we're finding major disconnects between what we think the plan is and what different senior leaders think is actually in the plan, what was promised, what's possible even. And he said, great. He says, I knew we had that. Now we know where they are and we can fix it. And they did. So that was an excellent value add right off the bat. So it was also mentioned quite a bit, the importance of communication. But I want to back up to a comment that was made about the helping people understand that large events are going to happen and that don't get complacent. And there's a psychology behind this. So you heard that word, the psychology. So we added in our, when I see a lot of heads nodding in the crowd, we added a course called Cognitive Bias and Enterprise Risk Management to recognize that. And it's a course that a lot of people are very excited about, is to build that into the understanding and the thinking and the work that we're going to do in ERM. And everybody on the panel commented about the importance of this. So we know you're all super smart, very technically capable, and we have a lot of technological tools and skills here. We also build into our program a lot about the human equation, right? So we have 2 of the 7, almost a third of the core curriculum, right? The courses, 2 major courses on communications, influence, and so forth. The managing human behavior in the organization, which is kind of a commodity course from the business school, and then the strategic communications for risk professionals, which I built, which is actually my favorite course. I love that course. So it's super important. You can build the greatest models, but if you're not going to get people to come along with you, you're not making any change. You want to influence change. We all want to make the biggest possible positive impact we can make, and it's always with and through other people. It's not because we built a great model. So, another comment that was made is about the opportunities in banking, but beyond, is in quantifying the harder to quantify risks. Quantifying the operational and also the strategic is more emerging too. And I want to point out to the panel, everybody in this room has been trained how to quantify all types of risks on a consistent, practical basis. You all know how to do that. So when you meet people and you're trying to get an interview or you're in an interview, you want to explain that skill. That's a saleable skill. You understand how to quantify in simple, clear, practical terms, cyber, broader InfoSec, other operational strategic risks. You can do it on a consistent basis so you can actually aggregate volatility of the entire organization. Another comment was made about mistakes. So Tom had said, don't bounce around too much. There are a lot of opportunities. It was said on the panel, a lot of opportunities, and it can be very juicy, the idea, but keep in mind, you want to learn and contribute, and if you get the reputation, you're going to bounce. When you're in a firm, people aren't going to invest in that relationship. They're not going to necessarily collaborate, cooperate. You're not going to get as much done, and you're not going to learn as much if people think you're a short-termer, that you just bounce in and out. Another comment was made about the mistakes of not identifying risk by source. So we talk a lot about that. It's super important because for many, many reasons. To get the whole stream of impact, to get the upstream source, to get the whole downstream impact, to get the context for scoring, even qualitatively before you quantify. It matters the source. Also, multiple independent sources need to be distinguished because they can happen simultaneously. So when you do combinatorics, to understand the overall aggregate volatility, you have to get that piece. And it is tricky. It is simple to fix if you know how, but it is a slippery thing that a lot of organizations, even when they get it, they slide back and then start looking at the risks incorrectly modeled by intermediate outcome or by outcome, not by source. Another comment was, don't make it too heavy. Don't have a process that's designed poorly. If it's just too heavy, and we know that we've seen a lot of the COSO ERM methodologies, just way too much paperwork and repetition and performance of all this gathering information. It's not used for decision making. People don't like that, so it has to be practical. We talk a lot about that in our curriculum. Don't forget the purpose of ERM is to actually achieve business goals, right? So everybody in this room also has learned how to actually quantify ERM to the point of, for any organization, explaining what is the likelihood of making plan, or making an exceeding plan, or missing it by a certain amount. That is the upshot. That is when you have everybody's attention, is what do we value? Let's define it. Now let's figure out how likely we are to miss that. And by the way, all the senior executives' long-term incentive comp, is tied to that. So we got everybody's attention, and people buy into that. That's really important. So I think there's a lot of alignment with what we're hearing. I think you in the audience, that you're hearing a lot of alignment with what's real in the market, what's needed, and what we're learning. There was, I think, another comment about networking. So yes, I love that this comment was made. Networking isn't just knocking on doors of who can get me a job, and I want a job now and get me a job. It's about helping others, investing long-term, building relationships, and Russ's comment about networking with your peers. But keeping in mind, you are Columbia. You're super smart. You're among an elite group. Leverage the time you have. Invest in spending time, meeting, cooperating, collaborating with your peers. There's a lot of learning that happens between and among you, but you're also constantly interviewing. You may be working for the person sitting next to you 5 years from now. And if you are cutting short the contribution on a case team, as Russ is alluding to, they're not going to forget that. They're going to remember that. And how you behave in the classroom, lecturers remember that. So when you ask, hey, can you recommend me for this job? And we're like, well, you didn't show up for some of the classes, and you didn't seem to hand things in time, and you always, that is an interview. You are constantly interviewing. So how you behave, how you dress, how you act, make the effort, because it will pay dividends, but it's also the right thing to do. So I think let's stop there. Before we continue with the panelists, so we'll continue with some food and drink in the back. Let's just take a moment to thank Tom, Russ, Oliver, and Eric for a wonderful, wonderful panel discussion. Thank you so much.